Today's dialogue is on marketing and art, which I thought was all relevant to all of us. So, Emma, you obviously study this academically, Laurel as an actual artist, Sanders as a writer, which is a form of art, regardless of how we do it. So, it's interesting. Today I was talking, I'll just set up a little bit of context. Today I was talking to somebody, interviewing somebody for a position at Hire a Writer and explaining how we have at Hire a Writer a 3-hour mandatory creative exploration, right? So if you're on staff with me, you're supposed to spend up to 3 hours a week just doing something creative, and not related to work and not necessarily has to be productive, but just carving out that time to kind of like feed your creative being. And I was explaining that the purpose of that is because the commercialization of your artistic ability can be over time extremely demoralizing, right? Where you feel like the only reason I'm doing this is because I have to achieve a specific result. And furthermore, the commercialization of an artistic skill also presents very artificial constraints that you wouldn't right? There are certain directions you can't go. You're stuck to a brand guide. And those constraints can be very painful over time for artistic individuals. And so when we think about using art in marketing, those two can feel fundamentally incompatible to a lot of people who are purists about the practice of art as a function of human expression. And it can also simply feel, maybe if you don't go that far and say that it's fundamentally immoral or something, it can feel very unpleasant over time or unfulfilling way to express yourself as an artist in the world. So I wanted to kind of have this dialogue today. The goal of a dialogue is not to arrive at any conclusions, but to hopefully expand our thinking by simply conversing and sharing ideas. So okay if there's quiet space, okay if we're just step aside and think for a moment. Nobody has to have answers. The idea is simply to share the way that we think about the topic of marketing and art. So does anybody have any preliminary thoughts about this topic? Like, have you thought about this topic before? And what are your general ideas about it?
I mean, I would say as a graphic designer, yeah, this is those sort of questions around art, as they say, art for art's sake versus art for marketing's sake, to sell product. These are all very much real to my experience in the corporate world. And I would say that I specifically chose a career in graphic design in part because I had those artistic inclinations. And I thought, well, first of all, I was realistic about my actual artistic talents, that I probably wouldn't be able to make a living with that. But even that aside, I wanted to keep something of that art expression to myself, for myself, and not have to be financially constrained with it, which is why I specifically chose graphic design as a career, because it was a way to sort of stay connected to what I was interested in and passionate about, but it was separate from my own personal artistic pursuits, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think on my end, it's been interesting because a lot of the things that I've studied in regards to art and communication, it's semiotics. So, the meanings of signs and symbols. And I think it's been really interesting, especially since I hadn't fully thought about it in depth until you asked me to do this. And I was like, oh, I actually have no idea what I personally think about marketing and art. But it's just been very interesting to kind of see it from the academic side, because it's just breaking everything down into studyable pieces. And I think for me, it almost got to the point where I was looking at it and I felt as though I understand the demoralization aspect of, if you're just creating for consumption, that can just really kind of eat away at a certain point. But I also don't quite see how we are able to market things without art, which I thought was an interesting kind of conclusion that I came to.
a bit of tension.
I think there's really with any creative endeavor, there's almost two sides of it to it. There's like the creative aspect, and there's almost the craft and discipline. Um, and I think like when it comes to like the demoralizing side of it, I think it might be leaning too far on the craft and discipline without really kind of finding the balance between the two. Like, you know, a carpenter can be very skilled at what they do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are, you know, pursuing it as a creative endeavor. Or like, say, a potter who is, you know, crafting something that's kind of outside what you might consider as like tableware, making, you know, plates or whatever that do have an element of artistic expression. You know, they're finding that balance between the two. But I think at least within a business realm, I don't know. I think that you need to find that balance between the two, even if you are working towards someone else's goal, like promoting their product or their brand with your creative output. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have, sorry, there's some dogs barking behind me, that you don't have that access to that creativity. I think it's about finding places where you can, you know, you know, be satisfied with whatever those constraints are. Like if you were a carpenter making a table, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not being creative by, you know, being very detailed with your work and being very prideful about what you output. Um, and from another side of it, I think that like even if you were, say, pursuing that like pure form of art, there's an element of marketing that is always going to be involved unless you just want to be like a hermit in the woods, you know, creating paintings or whatever it is. Like everyone who's seen success or found, you know, whatever their goals are in being like, oh, I am an independent artist, whether that's a musician or writer, you know, they do have to take marketing seriously. They do have to take promotion seriously. And, you know, that probably consumes more of their time than I think any one of them would like to admit, but it's a necessary element. Like if you want to break out in the music industry, you have a social media presence. You know, if you want to be on the New York Times bestseller list, you have to take promotion seriously. They just, I don't know, they're so intertwined that I just don't think there's really a one or the other.
I would also say that, like, in terms of the constraints, I think, you know, as an artist, there's always constraints, right? You're constrained by your medium and, you know, all these other things. And I think that um, you can learn a lot about, I don't know, your work, and even expand your creativity by having to work within those constraints, like learning how to get in touch with that creativity despite all of these restrictions that are placed on it. So I think it presents an extra challenge, but I think it can be helpful in a way.
And I think Sanders, you bumped up into some two really important, I guess, kind of semantic considerations, right? What do we mean by art? What do we mean by marketing? Because essentially where you ended in your last thought was that there is an inevitable social component to the sharing of art, right? Like you don't just like paint a painting and leave it in a room and burn the house down. Like most artists, some people do. Some people do. But I would say the vast majority of artists have an inclination to share their art, right? And that sharing of the art is a form of communication. And at an organized level, that becomes marketing. Because that's what marketing really is, right? Like people sharing something with other people. So I guess if we were to simplify the conversation, then it becomes, is there a right or wrong way to create in or inside or outside the context of community? And then is there some kind of threshold? Like at some point, does the sharing of your artwork become so disassociated from yourself, the creator of the work, that it deteriorates fulfillment or feedback or other important elements of improving your craft. I may have gone too far, but I think that's what you were alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've thought about that a lot because I also make music, and I'm kind of in the process of struggling with releasing it, putting it out, and having it out there. Because in my mind, like once you do that, it almost doesn't become, it's not yours anymore. It's open for interpretation, and it's also open for people to latch onto. Um, and I think that's something a lot of creatives struggle with, is that like how do I grow without alienating the people who have, found me early on or are in like in love with the work that I've already created. And it's like there's always this idea that you want to keep progressing, but at a certain point I think you have to accept that when you release it to a community it almost becomes the property of the community in a way. And I don't know, it's always been a form of communication, releasing work of any
Mhm.
kind. And I think a lot of people don't see it that way. Like you said, like when you share it with somebody, it's almost a form of marketing in of itself. You're like, hey, listen to this, or hey, you want to read this for me, and then you're releasing it into the world. It's almost like a child. Like you don't really have as much control over it as you think you do. I know it's a very strange idea to mull around because it almost has a life of its own.
Yes. I think you're right. So, a question that I had put together as, part of this conversation, part of this dialogue is, does the value of what you create for different purposes inherently alter the value of what you create? So, if I create something, right? If I write an ad, does the value of that ad inherently have increase or decrease based on how much of myself I put into it? And you can see that I'm leading towards like AI generated art. And is that a problem? Right. So does the source of the art matter? And do I attach more value to things that I feel I've put myself into? So for instance, the novel I'm writing about my son, does that have inherently more value than an email marketing sequence I create for a client? I know what my opinion is, but what is true? No,
I don't know if there is, I mean, at least in my opinion, I don't know if there necessarily is a true in that statement because I feel as though that is such like a personal thing to derive meaning from. Like because my personal opinion would that be it would be the book that would have more because it has just a more personal, it's more personal than necessarily like an email marketing campaign. But yeah, I don't necessarily know if there is a true for that or if it's just kind of based upon people's meanings. I know a marketing tactic would be to make it more personal because other that is a way that people could kind of connect with it. But still, yeah, I think it's a very personal thing. I don't know if there is necessarily like what is true there.
So I've sort of been like, I tend to think that meaning is inherent in individuals rather than in the work that we do per se. And I think that the work that we do per se can have that meaning because that meaning exists in us. But I don't see meaning as something that I can generate. And so, because of that, I think that in the same way that that meaning exists in me, it exists in, you know, other people. It exists in a tree, in an insect. That meaning is inherent within those things. And so, in that sense, I think there's meaning inherent within the things that we create, whether they're an ad or a fine art piece that hangs in a museum.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think meaning is what you make it. Like an email sequence might seem impersonal relative to like a graphic novel that you're writing that's very about you and your family, but if you reframe it and shift your perspective and think about how, say, that email sequence might influence, the person that you're writing it for, how might it connect somebody to a product that they need, like finding value where there might not seem like value at the front end. And that's all just a matter of perspective.
But interestingly, having, led this organization where we create things for a living, the people who survive in this field have that perspective. The people who don't and are like, I can't with the commercialization. I want to go do something more important. I want to go do something more meaningful, right? Which people do. They leave professional contexts, quote unquote, to go into non-professional contexts, quote unquote, which means like starving for your art, that kind of thing. Because they get disillusioned and they say, this has no meaning, right? What am I doing with my life? What's the point of this? And they can't see the humanity in it, or how, because I have meaning and other humans have meaning, these activities then, to your point, Laurel, maybe fundamentally have meaning, right? But that's where you watch people fall apart in this and you watch them walk away. Because the big complaint is, this is pointless. Or I am only going to write for purpose-driven brands. I am only going to work for brands whose missions align to mine, which is very close to starving for your art, because that's what you'll end up doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to be careful not to make value judgments about other people's decisions. Obviously we're working in these professional settings, and so I think it could be easy to say, oh, these other people can't be in the field because they don't have the same perspective as we do, like, aren't we enlightened? But I think individuals are different and they want different things from their life, and they have different passions that they want to pursue, and different levels of skill. Even, like I said, I couldn't go out in the world and survive as an artist. I don't have the talent for that, so I don't mind working in a corporate setting. But other people maybe do have more talent, and maybe it does make more sense for them to go do more with their art. So I think we just have to keep all of that in mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think and I think that that's a helpful gut check for me, that if I was being judgmental, of course I didn't mean to be, but I did mean to be, because I do have a stigma about people who do that, because it feels like they look down on the quality and value of what we do. And it's like, I'm an actual writer. I'm going to go write a novel. And I think I've seen that happen so many times that I feel protective of my field, because it's like, that's not fair. Like, what we do matters too, So that's probably where that's coming from in my heart, and I'm appreciative of the way you shed light on how that manifests, in that it's not kind or loving, but I think that's where it comes from, and that's where that feeling of like, don't disdain us or scorn us. Like, this is important, what we do, that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I mean, I definitely get that. And I think, even beyond how individuals may represent that, I certainly think there's a sense of that in culture sometimes as a whole, of, what culture says is, more pure or more valuable or more meaningful. And so, yeah, that can be challenging to deal with, for sure. I get that.
Yeah, and I think there's generally kind of a fair, perhaps an earned bias against marketing. because there are so many stinkers out there who are doing it from a total just place of maybe perpetuating systems that we would say are not totally ethical or truth seeking, or it becomes hard to differentiate yourself in that crowd. Like, but we're not doing things that way. But we're called the same thing. But we're different.
So my background in graphic design is in retail packaging. So on my more cynical days, I quip that I just make trash. It's like I make something that people throw away at the end of the day. Hopefully they recycle it.
Right.
But it's not something they keep or hold on to. So, but there's still, the packaging communicates something that enables the person to know if that's what they actually want to purchase or not. So if that's actually what the thing that they're looking for. So there's value in it, but yeah, sometimes it does feel kind of dark.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, essentially, if I were to decode what Sanders said, it's that, I mean, first of all, as an artist, you have to have enough of a thick skin where you just know that, like, what I am and what I do is not for everyone, right? Like, I know that my instinctive writing style is not for everyone. Now, I'm a ghostwriter, so I can chameleon it up for sure, and I don't have to speak in my own voice all the time, which is another part of why I think there's a bit of a tension between the writing community and the marketing community, right? But not everything I put out is for everyone, and it's not meant to be, right? The people with whom this resonates. So it's, to me, I think evaluating the value of what we put out into the world is a little bit measured by its effect. Right? Like, what effect does this have, and on what kind of people? Because there are certain messages you would put out there and they would have a very negative effect, and that would actually be right? Like, you would want people to not like something that's negative, and that's a whole category of marketing, right? Negative marketing. So I think it's kind of almost thinking about, like, what is the intended effect of this, and is it effective in that way? What are you thinking, Emma?
Honestly, I think at this point I'm just kind of taking in, because this isn't this isn't my area of expertise. So I think I'm right now like more just kind of fascinated with everyone else's perspectives, just because I'm like, oh, this is just not necessarily out of my wheelhouse, but I think I'm kind of contextualizing kind of just just what everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just kind of with a lot of, with marketing in particular, it's very interesting. Just I haven't particularly studied it, but with just kind of other pieces that have kind of danced around marketing, just in my experience of academia, the use of art to kind of engage in persuasive appeals, I think, has always been very interesting to me. And I think I'm sorry, I fully lost. This is why it's bad to only have one cup of coffee. I fully lost the thought.
Yeah, the value of art and persuasive appeals. I mean, scroll stoppers, right? If we're talking about social media and something that, you do study, that's what we're going for, right? Anytime we create art or artistic kind of content for social media, be it text or imagery, the goal is action, right? The goal is to stop the scroll and to create content that is persuasive enough or alarming enough or surprising enough that people stop scrolling and look at it for longer than, a millisecond. That's hard to do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is that not an art form in itself? Like, trying to create something that's both familiar enough to where it is not completely alien to someone, but subverting expectations to the point where it's at least like engaging and attention grabbing. Like I'm sure we've all seen like ads that just rehash the same things over and over again, and they're boring. But every once in a while, you'll see a commercial, and you'll be like, like I might not buy the product, but that was creative. That was pretty good. Kind of checked all the boxes, and there's a bit of respect in that. I don't know.
I feel especially with marketing to Gen Z as an audience, I 100% like even, I mean, I agree with you, Sanders, on the whole, but even more so in respect to them, just because I feel as though, just from what I've seen, they're a very hard audience to market to because they want authenticity. But to like replicate authenticity for marketing is such a fine line, I think, to follow and to then also be accepted by them. I think it's absolutely an art form.
Well, I mean, I think that's why a lot of companies work with influencers, right? Because a real person out there in the world who likes your product and wants to talk about your product and share that with other people, that's more authentic than an ad, maybe, or is perceived that way.
And I think, Sanders, I liked what you said about how that in and of itself is an art form. And I think that that's something that is really hard to communicate to purists who are like, what you're doing is garbage and you're setting the world on fire with your memes. And like the amount of understanding of predicting human behavior and reactions of a very specific niched subset or subculture is not, you should not underestimate how much understanding that takes. Like it takes an incredible amount of understanding to decode colloquialisms and thought patterns and predictable behaviors. And like there's an immense amount of psychology that goes into copywriting, right? As marketers, that we're never just writing as ourselves, and we're never just writing to people we know. We're writing as someone else, right? On behalf of the brand to a subculture of people we may never have interacted with in the human experience, right? But that we've studied and know, almost like anthropologists, right? Like who are they? How do they talk? What do they like? And to do that effectively in a way that actually reads as authentic, because the reality is it's not authentic at all, right? Authentic would be me, a 38-year-old woman sitting in South Jersey. Like who I really am is nothing of what I do really as a copywriter. I'm playing somebody else, speaking to something else. That's artistic. That's creative.
That's like acting.
Right.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly,
that's just Sanders jokes like that. Like he literally, for some clients, has to like be somebody else when he's writing. Aren't you the one who said that?
Yeah, well, that was a particular client. The persona, like they linked it to a celebrity persona, and they were like Tony Stark as Iron Man. So there was like a witty but informative and authoritative tone. And it took me a while to get into it, but now I have a little fun with it. I get to be Iron Man. I mean, I'm talking about advertising, but it's if Iron Man was talking about advertising.
Right. Yeah. So
see, those are some of the constraints that present a new creative challenge.
Big fan.
Exactly.
Constraints. So Laurel, you mentioned at the top of the call, and I kind of want to circle back to it, the notion of kind of compartmentalizing maybe your professional artistic pursuits and your personal artistic pursuits. And I think that's quite common. And I would like us to kind of like speak to that ourselves. Like, is that common for all of you? And maybe Laurel, you can explain your thought process in that a little bit more. And how does that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does go back, I guess, to that those ideas of the constraints, right? Because when I'm creating designs, I'm using my computer, everything's digital predominantly. But I like working with my hands, so I like to not be on a screen. I'm on a screen all day at work. So I like to do something that's not on a screen. I like to work with my hands. I like to use a different medium and, create the things that are, in the world around me and in my head, and sort of like bring together other ideas that, that doesn't have all of the same constraints as it does in my job. Now I still get a lot of creative satisfaction from doing design work. So when I have more creative opportunities in my job, then I don't feel as much of a need to do as much on my own personal stuff. And then when I feel like there aren't as many creative opportunities, I'm just sort of like, churning out stuff from an existing brand guide or something, not a lot of creativity involved. Then I will have more of an inclination to spend time on that. So I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but I do think like creativity itself, I mean, there's a difference too, I think, between creativity and art. Because I think, I think even if you aren't doing art, you can still express your creative abilities, creative problem solving, for example, right? Like there's many opportunities to sort of flex your creativity, separate from just producing art. But producing art is also something that I'm passionate about, that I have to do. Sometimes I'm just sitting there and I'm like, oh, I've got to make something. Like I just have to. Like I don't know what it's going to be, but I got to do it. I just got to get it out. Like something has to come. And then other times you see something and you feel particularly inspired. And you're like, oh, I'm going to create something based on that idea. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm getting a little rambly. Anybody feel free to jump in. Save
No,
me.
I like that. I think that's interesting. You almost have like a budget in yourself.
Have what?
You have like a budget that you like have to spend on like artistic pursuits. Like if you don't spend it, it's like it builds up.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of that way, I suppose. Yeah, but
you're like, what a terrible reductionistic way to think about my artistic soul.
It's a way of looking at it. That yeah,
it's a bad way, but it's a way. Yes. Okay, I like that. Sanders, you've got a similar, like you have a very robust personal, with music and all of that, and then obviously you create words for a living.
Yeah.
How does that work?
It's a little bit harder because what I do is on the screen as well. I'm like kind of trying to find the balance there right now. But I also still play guitar and stuff. But yeah, especially on the weekends, I think I'm gonna get that inspiration and that creative push to kind of work a little bit. Sometimes I try to force it and I get a little frustrated. But I really like Laurel's point about like creativity is kind of the other outside of, it's integrated obviously, but it's outside of creating work. Because I remember it was sometime this week, we hadn't gone to the store, had to make something for dinner, looking in the cupboard for something, and I was getting really kind of frustrated with myself because I was like, oh, I think I just need to go to the store. And then it just like popped in my head. And I was like, oh, what if I do this? And I got this and I'll go with that. And I forget what I made, but it ended up being really, really nice. A really nice meal, checked all the boxes, satisfying, it's creative. And through that whole process, I was like so satisfied by it because I got to be creative. I was presented with a problem, well, a few, like not many ingredients, you're hungry, need to eat. And it felt very like almost routine. But then, I don't know, something just sparked. Maybe it was just the fact that I had exactly what I needed to make this particular dish and make actually something nice rather than just food. And it was very creatively satisfying. So yeah, I mean, that creative energy, I'd like to direct it towards music when I have a surplus, but wherever it comes out, I think that's relief and satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Emma? Do you feel like you have sets of artistic pursuits. I know being an academic too is a little tricky because I'm sure that's not very artistic or creative.
I mean, I think I look at creativity a little bit differently in academia because I think I do, as Laurel said, kind of derive creative satisfaction from my work, but it's less like necessarily art and more so like figuring out how to frame a sentence or kind of, you know, very specific writing creativity there. Normally, when I'm not in my first semester of a doctoral program, I have much more creative energy. I'm slowly getting back into it, but I mean, I've played guitar for 14 years at this point, so I gravitate to that a lot. I've started getting into painting because my actual like drawing and painting skills, I've been told, rival a 5-year-old's. I enjoy it. I'm just
savage.
Yeah, it's a skill I need to work on that I'm slowly working on. But yeah, I think I kind of have to kind of go with the energy flow of where, like, and that varies week by week, where some weeks I'll be like, oh, I have so much energy, I want to do all of this. And then other weeks I'm like, I could like do like a little, like one of those like adult paint by numbers. Like I'll do that for like a little bit. I'm like, yeah, I'm getting the creative satisfaction and I'm good. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting balance to kind of have to figure out there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you, Joy?
Yeah, I think I would never in a million years describe myself as an artistic person. Like, I'm just not. Like, I'm not. And I used to think that meant that I wasn't creative. And I would say, like, well, I'm just not really a creative person. But I think that Laurel's articulation of that distinction actually resonates really strongly with me because I really kind of shed, like, I mean, I play music, I sing, I read, I write, I do all these things that would be maybe categorized as artistic. But at the end of the day, my sense of joy or fulfillment is really about being productive. And I used to think that was bad. And it meant that like I'm not like in touch with my humanity or I'm just too harsh of a person. But at the end of the day, like I am creative all the time. I mean, I run this business and all this, you know, I have to be creative a lot. But I like there to be proof of my creativity. Like I like at the end of the day to have like a checked off checklist, and I have creatively solved all these problems. I've creatively come up with all of these solutions. Like I've built things from scratch that didn't exist, and like, and that's part of why I'm an entrepreneur, right? Like this didn't exist and now it exists. And that is proof like that I matter or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I really don't have any like artistic pursuits at all. Even with my creative writing. So like my husband and I are writing a book. He's doing the graphic novel version. I'm doing the novelization. And like, it's about productivity. It's about how many pages I can get through a day. And I don't care what they say. Like it's a weird, and it's funny working with another. So I would say my husband is the exact opposite. He is incredibly artistic and very artistically intuitive. And he wants to like build the world and like populate it and set rules for it and imagine heritage of all these different creatures and this and that and the other. And like I have a very limited threshold for like ideation. I want to move into action very quickly. And so having to like give and take in a collaborative artistic endeavor with somebody who's highly artistic when I am very, very low in my artistic abilities or really even interests has shed a lot of light on what I do and don't want and then that kind of thing. And what I am and am not good at, right? Like I've uncovered these incredible inadequacies in my own artistic abilities or creative thinking that have been really helpful to me as a person, really, not even as a professional, but just as a person to be like, I don't understand how his brain works. And like, I don't understand how you can go to all these incredible, I mean, what he can come up with is like magic. Like this didn't exist in that, like his ability to do that is so far beyond mine. So I do think there is some kind of innate quality, some way you're wired. And yeah, I don't know. So it's interesting. I'm not particularly artistic at all, and yet I am technically a creative professional.
Definitely. I mean, I work, yeah. Because I work in, like, I don't work for a design house. I work for a company at an in-house design department. So I interact with, all kinds of other departments and people in my job. And there's so many times where, especially like in serving on some of our work committees and stuff, and people would be like, "Oh, you're the creative person," and I'm always forever correcting people. I'm like, "No, you're creative too. We're all creative in different ways. Like maybe I can produce a piece of art or design." That's one segment of creativity, but I don't have like you know, I don't own creativity.
Mhm.
So yeah, I 100% agree with you that, yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. There are various versions of it. And I think learning to let whatever fulfills you be what fulfills you and not attach judgment to it and be like, that's okay.
Yeah, that's uh, when I graduated from high school, CW, my husband, obviously we weren't married at the time in high school, but he left a note in my high school graduation book that I had that said, "Do what you love to do best, and you'll always do it well." And I think that is very true. And so yeah, I think, Joy, to your point, you absolutely have to understand who you are, what you enjoy doing, and that's your thing,
Mhm. Yeah. And then I think, it almost circles back to the idea of community, because I think that too, there's a huge challenge of when you are maybe less of an artistic individual, you tend to not know what your contribution is to a community of people who are artistic. And that's unique for me because I lead creative professionals for a living. And yet, and some of them are quite artistic. I mean, Sanders, you're way more artistic than I am. Um, and so I struggle sometimes to find the balance of like, how much do I push them? How much do I let them pursue their own process? How much is the commercialization of this skill going to defeat them? How do I safeguard them against that defeat? Like, how do I best facilitate, like, how do I bring out the best in an artistic person when the context is inherently commercialized work?
Well, speaking as somebody who was, because I managed the creative department, and so I had creatives reporting to me and was a creator, and even I still struggled with, how do I do that for my creative team members? How do I not throw my artistic inclinations all over whatever they're trying to do? So there's similar kinds of, I think, concerns, and I don't think there's any single good answer. I mean, I think like each person is individual, and you have to learn how to approach each one differently. I don't think it's one size fits all. So
Because I have Sanders, who's super easy and agreeable, right? He's just a lovely gent. And so he'll flex, he'll adapt, and he doesn't become too weary. He knows how to manage himself. So you have people like that who are quite mature and developed in those skills. And then there can be other people who don't know how to manage their creative energy and either are like balls to the wall or completely running on fumes. And that fluctuation as a leader becomes really complicated because the work output is what makes us money. And so having a reliable cadence it can't be contingent on somebody's whims or mood. Like,
well, and that is one of the challenges of being a you know a professional working, like like I said, for me, for graphic design, like that's a real challenge because yeah, you don't always wake up every day feeling inspired. You don't always wake up every day with creative ideas. And sometimes somebody says, "Oh, we want X," and you're sitting there staring blankly at the wall, and you're like, I don't have any idea what to do for this, but you're on a timeline. You have to deliver something by a certain time, and as an artist, sometimes it can really burn you up on the inside to put something out there that is not your best, or to feel that you weren't able to take the appropriate time with. But I don't know. After being in the field for so long, I kind of got used to it, I guess. You figure out how to be okay with it. And that goes back to sort of that divide too, right? Well, I didn't do my best on this work project because I was running low on ideas and whatever, but now I get home and I can do something that does satisfy me and I feel better. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't envy your position of trying to manage a bunch of creatives.
Wonderful creative people. I don't know, Sanders, what do you need from somebody who is leading you?
Ooh. I'm definitely like a you show me and then I do it kind of learner. I'm very hands-on, and I think a lot of that is just being comfortable with the initial failures and being comfortable with, like, I guess, damage control. So that's another side of it. But something that always has kind of resonated with me about this whole, the whole journey I've been on with Hire a Writer, my copywriting career, and something you told me a while ago, which is like falling in love with the process and almost falling in love with the discipline of being a creative in a professional space. And I think that's very, very hard to wrap your head around, especially, this is a very heart centered thing, creating art, being creative. It feels like it's, up there in the clouds, but a lot of it is really like fundamentals brought down to the ground, skills that really anybody can learn if they put their effort into it. So I think, I don't think it's perfect for everybody, but kind of framing it in that way, like if you can write this boring piece of content with the kind of energy that you'd put into anything else, then when you approach whatever else that next thing is, you will now have that discipline and that skill to bring to your own thing or whatever the next chapter might be. I don't know. There's value in everything that I do, even if it seems menial at the time. And a lot of that is just looking back. I think in the moment it can be hard to be like, this is good for me. But I remember you said something about innate skill when you're talking about Chris. And when I was probably 16 or 17, I really wanted to start making music. So I downloaded this program called Fruity Loops, which is a digital audio workstation. Spent maybe 30 minutes messing around, and I was like, I'm not good. I don't think I'll ever be good. And I put it away. And I started taking music seriously when I was like 24, 25. And then I was like, if I just work at it for like 4 or 5 years, really try to learn, elements of music theory, composition, arrangement, all of these like different elements of creating what I wanted to create. Like eventually I got to the point where I was like, oh, I'm not producing something that's terrible anymore. It's kind of good. And then the click for me, it's like, oh, anybody could do this. Sure, I'm sure there is that element of natural ability, and that helps. But at the end of the day, it's like these are still skills and disciplines that you can learn, and creativity is something that you can strengthen and something that you can build up. It's for everyone.
Yeah. I think that's a vitally important perspective. I think the concept of a prodigy stops most competitive people before they begin. That and the fear of failure, public failure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I'm not going to put this out. How many artists are there who are sitting out there who are sitting on wonderful work that they're
Mm-hmm.
too afraid to share with the world? I think that's real. I think that happens.
Yeah, and I reflect too Joy, you're commenting that, you know, you're not artistic, and even though I might characterize myself as artistic, I, you know, did struggle for many years with, can I actually call myself an artist, you know?
Mm.
And, you know, what does that mean? And at what level do I have to be able to output? At what, you know, how many things do I have to be making? Or, you know, what is that threshold to be able to identify that way? And I think, that's where, you know, you have to be careful with identifying yourself with things. I think that's sort of the, you know, I can say like, oh, I have interest and inclination towards art. It's something that I enjoy doing, but I don't necessarily have to let that define like the core of who I am. That's part of who I am. But that's not necessarily all that I consist of. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I feel like that was a little tangential.
But I think you're right, and I think that and not to disparage, but like the writers who struggle the most making a living from writing are the ones who perhaps take the output too seriously and feel it's too precious and personal. And I think that idea of there is a threshold at which I must be, right? I must be performing at a certain level, or I must be X amount productive or whatever. Or I am a failure. Like that binary thinking is hugely problematic and limits your ability to really produce much of anything because there's an immense amount of failure. And so I think for people like that, I would suspect those are the people who just haven't ever been in a community where it's like, come here, share your work. We love you regardless. You know, the things that you need in order to have that psychological safety to be able to then take a risk and say like, what about this? And for other people to have permission to be like, no, not that. Or yes, that, but you know, like for there to be an actual meaningful collaboration among people, there has to be a sense of safety. And then you have to be brave enough to enter it with some open-mindedness.
And I think, you know, sometimes that inner drive you have, it just forces you to be brave. It's like I said, like, you know, sometimes I just have to create, and it just doesn't almost even matter. It doesn't matter if it's good. It just has to be done. And Sanders, I really like what you were saying about like, you know, sort of this recognition that you tried this thing with music and you're like, oh, I'm not going to be good, and you gave up, but then, you know, you went back and kept trying, presumably because it was something you really enjoyed doing, something you really wanted to do, something you were passionate about, something that you just had to do, and eventually you know, you were able to practice at it and have some, you know, some personal growth in that way. And I think that's really awesome.
Well, thank you. I think I just learned to love the process of learning, honestly. That's what a lot of it was. It's like, you know how you get good? You read the book and then you practice.
Or
And
watch the YouTube tutorial or whatever.
Yeah,
Find
absolutely. It's with YouTube these days. I mean, you could learn anything.
I think I can't remember. I think I like wrote something about it once, but like work is the 4-letter word, right? And we've created this whole like stigma in our culture that like we don't want to work. And if we have to work, we're going to have an attitude about it. And we better work as little as possible. And that is so counterintuitive to our nature. Like if you didn't have a job, you would still work. You would work the land. You would work in your garden. You would work at a hobby. I mean, it is a total misunderstanding that if you love something, it will come easy. If you love something, it won't be work. Or if you're good at something, it won't be work. I mean, it's asinine and it undermines people's skill development because they're like, well, suddenly I've gotten to a point of friction. This must be the edge of my talent. And it's like, it's not the edge of your talent. That's an invitation to like put the reps in. And I tell writers that all the time. The way I start writers is painful and they hate it and they hate me. because they have to sit there and they have to write 30 blogs about plumbing a week. Like you have to get so good at the little stuff that you can move on to the big stuff, because until you have that foundational ability, everything will be too hard and you'll give up, right? You have to build over time. And so I think it's like, it frustrates me when I watch people with tons of potential encounter that friction point and think, oh, okay, now I'm not good at it anymore. Like that's as good as I'm going to get, instead of pushing through that barrier and being like, well, on the other side of this hard thing, there's something beautiful. So I'm going to move.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and similarly, Emma, I think you talking about how your painting skills are like a child's, but you do it anyway. I think that's good, and I think it, again, you have to do the things that you enjoy doing, and it doesn't always matter if it's, what does it mean for it to be good? Who decides? You do what you need to do for you, and maybe you have the perspective to understand that's maybe not something to share with the rest of the world, but that's okay. I think not everything that we do, I mean, I think, as an artist, I do think there's an important element of sharing your work, but I also think that not everything has to be shared to be worthwhile or to have value or whatever. I can appreciate that, like you said, Sanders, like appreciate the process of learning to do things and learning, new ways. I don't know. So
No, I think with me, I have a lot of like perfectionist tendencies. So the ability to like just, create something that I'm like, no one is ever going to see it because I physically can't let anyone see this. But also creating it in mind with knowing it's just for me, I think kind of helps unlock that creative momentum there too, where I'm like, well, okay, like this doesn't have to be perfect, and that's okay. And I think
yeah.
that's definitely been helpful with me in that area.
Yeah, I tell myself that all the time because I'm also tend to be perfectionist, and yeah, I tell myself all that time, well, I'm just making this for me.
Well, and I like the way you defined kind of the lack of ability to judge. The idea that we have the capability to judge someone else's self-expression is asinine and insane. Like that's actual insanity to be like, no, what you think is flawed, or it's a silly way to say like something that I think is just totally inaccurate. Like you lack enough information about somebody's internal life to be able to say that what they're expressing to you about their internal life isn't true to them. Like, you don't have that information. It's like my son every day like gets out of the bath in like this crazy way. And one time I made the mistake of being like, dude, like that, why don't you just get out of the bath like a normal person? Right. And I've had to do the like backwards now correction every single time of like, because he'll be like, oh, I should get out of the bath like a normal person. And I'm like, nobody's normal, Gus. Nobody's normal. Normal is not a thing. Like, and trying to correct that. And so I think that's, we have to bring that level of kindness to interactions with other people who are pursuing artistic things, because it's like, who's to say what you create is good or bad or ugly or beautiful or all those things. All right. Any final thoughts? Marketing and art. We strayed a little, but we covered some of this.
Kind of perfect for a conversation on art, really,
all over the place. Anything we didn't say? Yeah, final thoughts.
I mean, anything we didn't say, but where was my thought? I just had it. I think creating art for art's sake and for yourself, like that's a creative endeavor and a way to express your kind of creative energy in yourself. But I think if you want to share it and want to be part of a larger community and reach an audience, there's no way to avoid marketing.
I think that there's an aesthetic aspect in everything. I think everything that exists in the world has a certain aesthetic quality to it. So I don't know.
All right. Well, thanks for the dialogue, guys. This was a nice way to end the week. And CW is commenting some obscure philosophers, as per usual.
I
Hi, CW.
probably know who they are.
And Duvert, he always talks about that guy. All right. Thanks.